In 1957, inside a cramped backstage hallway in Memphis, Lamar Fike leaned toward Elvis and whispered one short line of advice. By the time Elvis walked back out, that quiet sentence had changed how he saw Johnny Cash and himself for the rest of his life. On a humid night in the late 1950s, only 3 people stood in a narrow corridor 30 feet from the stage. Yet what Lamar Fike told Elvis in those few seconds shaped years of music, fame, and the way 2 legends would remember each other. In a concrete hallway behind a packed arena, Elvis asked Lamar one terrified question before meeting Johnny Cash for the first time, and Lamar's answer, just 14 words, silently rewrote the rivalry millions thought they knew. In 1956, while fans screamed outside and Cash's voice rattled the walls, Elvis froze at his dressing room door. The ordinary choice Lamar pushed him to make in that hallway would echo through every honest song Elvis chased after that night. The hallway outside the stage felt smaller than usual that night. The concrete walls sweated with heat, the roar of the crowd thudded through the floor, and somewhere beyond the doors, a low, steady voice was singing about walking the line. Elvis Presley paced a narrow strip of worn linoleum, his boots tapping out a rhythm that did not match the music. Lamar Fike watched him and understood something the crowd could not see. Elvis was not nervous about the show. Elvis was nervous about the man down the hall. Johnny Cash was finishing his set. Each line rolled out like it had been carved out of dirt and hard work, the kind of sound that made older men nod and say, "That is the real thing." Reporters had been whispering the same comparison for months. Elvis was the phenomenon. Cash was the conscience. One filled stadiums, the other filled the space inside a man's chest. Those lines drifted backstage. They stuck to Elvis no matter how many jokes he cracked. Lamar had seen Elvis walk into rooms full of movie stars and politicians without blinking. Something felt different now. Elvis had stopped packing and sunk into a chair, eyes fixed on the floor. A moment passed before he spoke, and when he did, the words were quiet enough that only one person heard them. "What if he thinks I am fake, Lamar?" The question hit harder than the crowd outside. Here was the man girls screamed for, the man who could not walk out of a hotel without causing a near riot, asking if another singer would see straight through him. Lamar felt the weight of it. That fear did not come from sales numbers or chart positions. It came from a boy who grew up poor, who still measured himself against the hard, honest voices from fields and church pews. A knock sounded at the door. Someone shouted that Johnny wanted to say hello after his set. The hallway would soon be full of people, full of noise and performance. Elvis kept his eyes on Lamar. The mask, the hair, the gold jacket, all waited on the hanger. Underneath stood a young man who wanted to know who he really was in the eyes of another Southern boy. Lamar knew his role. His job was to keep things light, keep the machine moving, keep the colonel happy. That night he broke his own pattern. Instead of a joke, he answered his friend. He leaned closer and gave Elvis a line that did not sound like a manager speaking to a product. It sounded like one scared kid talking to another. "Walk in there as the boy from Tupelo," he said, "not as the name on the posters." Those words did not change the charts or the contracts. They changed something smaller and far more dangerous. They changed the story Elvis told himself about who he was allowed to be when he stood in front of another legend. This is the story of how a single sentence from Lamar Fike shaped the night Elvis finally met Johnny Cash, and how that quiet moment in a crowded hallway echoed through both of their lives long after the applause faded. By the time most fans learned his name, Lamar Fike was already a fixture in Elvis Presley's world. He was the big kid from Texas with the loud laugh, the one who could make Elvis smile when the room felt tight. To outsiders, he looked like just another member of the entourage. To Elvis, he was one of the very few people who had known him before the legend hardened around his shoulders. In the early days, Memphis did not feel like a myth. It felt like sweat, gravel, and neon. Nights on Beale Street hummed with music that spilled out of every doorway. Blues guitars cried from cheap amplifiers. Gospel harmonies floated out of church windows. Country songs rolled out of car radios as trucks passed by. Sun Records sat in the middle of that noise like a worn little ship, with scuffed floors and tired walls that had heard more hope than any building its size had a right to hear. Elvis walked into that world as a shy, polite young man who still said "sir" and ma'am, even to people younger than him. Lamar liked that about him. This was not a boy who was born with light on him. This was a boy who carried the dust of Tupelo on his shoes and his mother's worries in his eyes. Fame had not yet arrived, but something else already lived in his voice. There was a tremble that felt like a prayer and a shout that felt like a jailbreak. Lamar watched the way Elvis lit up when someone mentioned gospel quartets. Conversations about money or cars might slide past him, but talk about the Blackwood brothers or the Statesmen would pull him straight in. There was a hunger there that success alone could not feed. He wanted the sound that made people feel less alone in the dark. While Elvis clawed his way through the early sun sessions, another young man was fighting his own battle a few states away. Johnny Cash had grown up under a wide Arkansas sky that did not forgive weakness. Cotton fields, long days, and thin paychecks bent his back early. War took him far from home and brought him back with more questions than answers. When he began to sing, his voice did not try to sweeten anything. It stayed low and true, thick with the weight of things he had actually seen. The first time Lamar heard "I Walk the Line" on a radio in Memphis, he remembered the small reaction more than the song itself. Elvis had been halfway through sorting some fan letters, distracted and tired. The opening notes came out of the little speaker, steady as a heartbeat. Elvis stopped moving. For those few minutes, the world shrank down to that voice. No one spoke. No one dared to turn the dial. When the song ended, Elvis said very little. He just nodded slowly and murmured, "That man is serious." That was how respect looked on him. Not loud, not jealous, just quiet and thoughtful. Success began to circle Elvis faster after that. The small rooms gave way to bigger halls, then to arenas where the sound bounced off rafters instead of ceilings you could touch. Reporters found their angle for the new star. Some called him dangerous, some called him silly, some called him a miracle. The loudest voices were not always kind, yet even critics could not deny that something new had arrived. Those same reporters needed stories that stretched beyond one man. They started building comparisons. Articles framed Elvis as the face of youth, heat, and rebellion. Johnny Cash became the voice of the working man, the hard truth-teller who did not swivel his hips and did not wear gold. It made for easy headlines. It made for deep cuts in the mind of someone who felt both sides fighting in his own chest. Lamar saw those newspapers tossed around dressing rooms. He saw Elvis glance at them and act like he did not care. A wisecrack would usually follow. There might be a joke about being just a hillbilly who got lucky, or a comment about how the writers never bothered to ask what he actually listened to at night. The jokes were sharp and fast. The silence after them said more than the punchline. Road life magnified every doubt. On package tour, multiple acts shared a stage, a bus, or both. Bills often carried a row of names: country crooners, rock and roll shouters, gospel quartets. Johnny Cash's name began to appear in those lines more often. Sometimes his set fell before Elvis, sometimes after. The first few times their schedules brushed past each other, the meetings stayed brief. One night at a station, Elvis and Cash passed each other in a hallway. A quick nod, a handshake, a polite good show man as bodies flowed around them. Fans might have called it a moment. For the men inside it, it was barely a breath. Lamar stood nearby and noticed something small. Elvis held his smile a little tighter than usual. Cash's eyes, dark and steady, seemed to look past the gold and the hair and search for the boy underneath. The hallway swallowed them, and the night rolled on. Those near misses continued. Backstage rooms filled with smoke and chatter, while the two young men hovered at opposite corners, always close, rarely alone enough for a real talk. Managers, agents, and promoters had a stake in keeping their images sharp and separate. Elvis was supposed to be the dazzling star who belonged to everyone. Cash was supposed to be the sober storyteller who stood a step outside the circus. Colonel Tom Parker took that division very seriously. The colonel believed in control. He believed in brand. More than that, he believed that Elvis could not afford to look small next to anyone. Private friendships had to be weighed against public perception. Photo opportunities had to be calculated like chess moves. If another singer threatened the image, that singer needed to be handled, not embraced. Lamar lived in the middle of those currents. He carried bags, fetched food, cracked jokes, and quietly watched the way fame changed the air around his friend. Over time, he saw Elvis turn up the showman's side when strangers entered the room. The laugh grew louder, the accent thickened, the stories became bigger. When the door closed and the circle shrank back down to trusted faces, the volume dropped. In that quiet, real questions slipped out. Sometimes, late at night, Elvis would ask things that sounded less like a star and more like a boy worried his ticket might be taken away. "You think they will still come when I'm not new anymore?" he would ask. On another night, the question shifted. "You think these people like me or what they want me to be?" Lamar rarely had good answers. He tried to tell the truth gently and change the subject before it bit too hard. Each new Johnny Cash hit drew more attention. Songs about prison, struggle, and promise cut through the noise in a way that even screaming girls could not drown out. Critics praised the honesty. Some hinted that this was grown man music in a way Elvis's output could never be. Lamar heard the words authentic and serious thrown around until they felt like weapons. Elvis pretended not to care, but his knuckles whitened around coffee cups whenever certain reviews landed on the table. The tension built slowly, the way a pot warms on a stove without boiling. Tour schedules, chart positions, and music press chatter dragged the two names into the same sentences more and more often. Fans argued. Musicians took sides. Some said, "Elvis opened the door, Cash walked through it with the truth." Others insisted, "Cash sings what Elvis feels but cannot show." Lamar listened and stored those lines in the back of his mind. One afternoon, while the sun glared off the hood of the touring car, a piece of news changed the flavor of all that talk. A new run of shows had been announced. The bill placed Elvis and Johnny Cash on the same stage, in the same building, on the same night, with dressing rooms only a few doors apart. There would be no quick hallway pass this time. There would be no easy excuse to stay strangers. Lamar read the schedule twice. The page shook a little between his fingers. Here it was, the moment all that gossip had been pushing toward without knowing it. The press would smell a story. Managers would smell risk. The men at the center of it would have to decide whether to meet as rivals, as actors playing parts, or as two worn-out Southern boys who understood things the world would never read in a review. For Lamar Fike, that realization came with its own private fear. If Elvis walked into that meeting carrying nothing but the image the Colonel had built, something honest in him might die a little. If someone did not talk straight to him before that night ended, the idea that he was hollow next to Johnny Cash could sink roots that no applause would ever pull out. The venue looked like every other big hall on the tour schedule, but Lamar felt something different in the air the moment they pulled up. The parking lot lights cast long shadows across buses and trucks lined up like a small army. Crew members moved cases and cables with the kind of tense energy that comes out when a big night carries more weight than usual. Somewhere inside that building, Johnny Cash was already in his dressing room, warming his voice for the crowd. Elvis stepped out of the car and took a slow look around, as if measuring the space before he claimed it. A few fans had already slipped past security and shouted his name from behind a barrier. He lifted a hand and gave them a quick wave. From a distance, he looked exactly like the billboard version of himself. Up close, Lamar noticed the tiny signs that this night had settled deeper under his skin. The smile stayed on his face, yet his eyes were not really on the crowd. His gaze flicked over the loading bay and down the hall to where he knew the other name on the bill was waiting. Inside, the backstage corridors buzzed with noise. Radio men and local promoters walked with clipboards pressed to their chests. They talked in quick, sharp bursts, weaving Elvis and Cash into the same sentences like they were setting up a prize fight. One voice drifted out above the others for a second. A guy laughed and said, "You watch, this is the night folks decide who the real man of the people is." Another answered, "They already know. The one who sings about prison and hard times, not the one all the kids squeal over." That kind of talk had been circling for months, but hearing it within reach of the dressing room door gave it new teeth. Lamar felt his jaw tighten. He wanted to walk over and tell them to keep their opinions to themselves, yet he also knew that this was how the business worked. Conversation turned artists into characters and characters into headlines. Somewhere along the way, actual men got lost in the ink. As they reached Elvis's room, a low rumble slid under the other sounds. A guitar strum, simple and strong, came from down the hallway. A voice joined it, deep as gravel and smooth as a slow river. Johnny Cash was warming up. Those notes did not soar or flash. They stayed close to the ground, honest and steady, like someone telling the truth in a kitchen at midnight. The sound floated toward them, wrapped in the smell of sweat, cigarettes, and old wood. Elvis stopped at the doorway and listened. his body stilled in a way Lamar had seen only a few times before. A man could not fake that kind of stillness. It was the stillness of someone hearing something that reached past ego and straight into memory. For a few bars, the hallway, the crew, the schedule, all faded away. Only that voice remained, singing lines that spoke of promises and lines that must not be crossed. A small shift came over Elvis's face. His mouth curved into a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He turned toward Lamar with a light laugh that felt borrowed from another day. "Boy can sing," he said. Lamar heard the words. He also heard the extra note hidden inside them. Admiration sat side by side with a quiet question. How do you stand next to a voice like that and not feel lighter in your own shoes? The big man guessed Elvis felt that weight, even if no one else in the hallway could see it. Word soon spread that Cash had arrived with his own worries. A musician who had wandered between the rooms mentioned pills on the table, long silences between jokes, and the way Johnny stared at the wall before he picked up his guitar. More than one person whispered that the label wanted him to lean into the serious image, the man with deep songs and deeper scars, while promoters wanted something flashier to match the frenzy of rock and roll. Expectations boxed him in just as much as they did Elvis. Both men lived in cages they had not built. None of that softened the way people talked when they thought the stars could not hear them. In the hall outside the dressing rooms, conversations ran on the same tracks. One group swore that Cash had the truth on his side. Another claimed that Elvis had changed the whole sound of the country and that feelings alone did not sell out arenas. Opinions bounced back and forth like a game, and each side used the other man as a stick to measure what real meant. Lamar carried coffee into Elvis's room and set the cup down on a table already cluttered with letters, ashtrays, and stage notes. The room smelled like hairspray and aftershave. Cloaks and jackets hung in a neat row, ready to turn a slim southern boy into the figure that thousands had come to see. A few band members joked near the door, tossing lines back and forth about the crowd and the town and the drive-in. Elvis joined in with easy replies, yet his timing seemed half a beat off. The charm came on, then slipped for a second before he tightened it again. A stray comment about Johnny made the air change. One of the guys said, "You know, man, they keep playing his stuff like he is the voice of every man that ever hurt. Papers love him." Elvis responded with a grin, "Well, they can print all they want. I am just trying to sing my songs, man." His tones sounded light. His fingers told another story. They drummed against his knee, faster than the rhythm of his words. Lamar watched that detail and tucked it away. The shield had not cracked, although it had begun to bend. Time moved oddly, as show hours always did. Minutes stretched during quiet spells and then snapped back when someone called for sound check or a last-minute change. The colonel floated in and out like a restless cloud, checking on costumes, set lists, and the mood in the building. He listened to reports from the hallway and the ticket line. Numbers mattered to him more than any feeling in the room. When word reached him that Johnny Cash wanted to stop by and say hello after his set, Colonel Parker's face hardened. He did not raise his voice. He never had to. Authority hung on him like another coat. He turned to Elvis and spoke in that steady, careful way he used whenever he felt danger. "You be polite," he said. "Shake his hand, tell him you like his songs, and then you come back here. You are not out there to blend in with every serious singer who walks through these halls. You are the show, remember that." The message carried more than simple advice. It was a warning. Pride and distance were part of the image in the colonel's eyes. Getting too close to other stars could blur the outlines that had been drawn so carefully. A small voice inside Lamar pushed back against that idea. He had sat with Elvis in cheap diners long before anyone cared about image. Back then, the young singer had talked with awe about every musician he admired. He had never asked whether it hurt his brand to love someone else's work. Somewhere along the way, success had taught him that admiration might look like weakness if shown in the wrong light. Arguments formed in Lamar's mind, then crashed against the walls of his position. The colonel paid the bills, set the schedule, and controlled access to Elvis. Steps out of line carried a cost. Jobs in this world disappeared fast when a man stopped being useful or easy. That knowledge pressed down on Lamar's shoulders while he watched the friend he had known sit under fluorescent lights, trapped between raised expectations and private doubts. Sound from the stage rolled in as the night moved on. The act before Cash finished. Applause swelled, then faded as crews shifted equipment. A few minutes later, the opening notes of Johnny's set punched through the thin walls with more force than the chatter around them. Songs about prisons and promises and hard roads bled into the corners of Elvis's room. Each line reached back to fields and kitchens and nights when a man had nothing but his word and his work. Elvis sat very still during one of those songs. No joke came, no offhand comment lightened the moment. Silence settled among the people in the room. Even those who stuck with Elvis out of habit or opportunity could feel that the show outside mattered in a different way tonight. The other man on the bill was not just a colleague, he was a mirror. After the final number, the crowd roared. That sound started as a far-off thunder and rolled closer as Cash left the stage. Stomps and cheers echoed under the floor, feet pounded down the back steps. Stagehands shouted directions and started clearing for Elvis's set. The noise reached a peak, then broke into scattered fragments as people rushed to their next tasks. Into that chaos slipped a simple knock on the door. A young assistant stuck his head inside and said, "Johnny wants to come by for a minute after he gets changed." "That all right, sir?" Elvis did not answer at once. The room fell so quiet that Lamar could hear the faint tick of a watch on someone's wrist. Every face turned in his direction. The next words would set the tone for whatever came after. He nodded slowly. "Sure," he said, "be good to see him proper." The assistant left. Conversations that had been buzzing moments earlier came back in low, careful tones. Nobody wanted to say something foolish with a meeting like that about to happen. Band members checked their gear again. A hairstylist adjusted a collar that had already been perfect. Everyone needed something to do while they waited. Lamar watched Elvis in that brief pause between outside noise and the arrival of another legend. The young man's shoulders flexed under his shirt. One hand rose to tug at the cuff, then dropped. His leg began to bounce. The image on the posters never fidgeted like this. Posters did not move. Posters did not wonder. Living men did. Thoughts tumbled through Lamar's mind. Words he might offer formed and vanished. He considered saying that Cash was just another guy, that none of this mattered, that Elvis could coast into the conversation on name and charm alone. Each of those options tasted like a lie before it reached his tongue. Cash was not just another guy. The meeting did matter. Elvis could not coast into it without paying a price somewhere deep down. The Colonel's warning hovered in the back of his head. Play it safe. Keep the roles clean. Avoid anything that might make Elvis appear as lesser than the other man, even for a moment. That approach had protected tickets and headlines. It had never protected the quiet part of Elvis that still asked if he was enough. Voices and footsteps started again in the hallway, this time slower and more focused. Johnny Cash was on his way. The sound of that approach made the small room feel even smaller. The door stayed closed, yet the moment had already reached them. Elvis stood. The chair scraped lightly against the floor. He smoothed the front of his shirt in a motion that tried for grace and landed closer to nervous habit. For several heartbeats, he did not look at anyone. Then he lifted his eyes to Lamar. "What do I even say to a man like that?" he asked. No bravado sat inside that question. It did not come from the star who had conquered charts and stages. It came from the boy who had once sat in a small house listening to voices on the radio and wondering how they had found the words for everything he felt. That boy now had to greet one of his heroes as an equal while the world waited to judge which man seemed more real. Lamar felt the weight of that moment more than any stage light or spotlight he had ever seen. Everything in him knew that there were easy answers he could offer. He could say, "Tell him you love his records." He could say, "Tell him you are the king," and leave it at that. He could follow the line the Colonel wanted and push Elvis toward distance and pride. Something in his chest refused those paths. Memories rushed forward. He remembered the quiet nights when Elvis spoke about gospel music with tears in his eyes. He remembered the way Elvis leaned closer to old men in diners, wanting to hear their stories, not to impress them. He remembered how much it mattered to this young man to be seen as more than some loud, glittering shape on a stage. That was the version of Elvis Lamar wanted to protect, even if it meant trouble later. His next words would shape how Elvis walked through that door, how he faced Johnny Cash, and how he saw himself in the presence of another man he admired. Lamar took a breath and chose his loyalty. The answer rose in his throat, simple and clear. This was the line that would change everything. Lamar did not dress the words up. He did not circle around them. He looked at Elvis and spoke as if they were back in some small kitchen, not in a dressing room 30 feet away from another legend. "Walk in there as the boy from Tupelo," he said, "not as the name on the posters." The room went very quiet. That sentence cut straight through the hairspray and the stage jokes and the chatter from the hallway. For a heartbeat, Lamar felt naked saying it. A member of the crew had no business telling the biggest star in the world to be anything smaller than the image everyone had built around him. Elvis stared at him. His eyes searched Lamar's face as if he needed to decide whether this was an insult or a rescue. Pride flickered first. A tiny edge came into his voice. "You trying to say I am not big enough to stand with him?" he asked. The question had heat in it. Underneath the heat there was hurt. Lamar stayed steady. He knew if he backed down now, the line would turn to dust and the fear behind it would win. "I am saying he already met the name on the posters," Lamar answered. "He saw that from the stage. What he has not met is the boy who sang his heart out in little rooms no one remembers. That is the one he will respect. That is the one you can live with when you come back in here." A long breath left Elvis's chest. Some of the sharpness in his eyes softened. The fight went out of his shoulders by a small degree. Nobody else spoke. Band members shifted their weight and glanced away as if they had just walked in on a conversation that was too honest for them. Elvis looked down at his hands, then back at Lamar. "You really think he wants to meet that boy?" he said. "Man like that," Lamar replied. "He does not need another poster. He already has his own. He wants to look another human being in the eye, same as you." Something inside Elvis seemed to settle on those words. His fingers stopped tapping. His foot stilled. A different kind of silence filled the room, heavier but calmer. The mask that usually slid into place in moments like this did not rise as quickly. A second knock sounded at the door. The young assistant leaned in again, nervous energy all over his face. "Mr. Presley, Mr. Cash is on his way down," he said. "Should be here in a minute." Elvis nodded. "All right," he answered, voice low. "Tell him I am here." The door closed. The space grew even smaller. Time seemed to pool in the corners. Every person in that room understood that the night had reached its hinge. Lamar watched Elvis stand a little straighter. The showman posture returned, yet now it came with something quieter underneath. The boy from Tupelo had been reminded that he still existed. That boy stepped up beside the star and shared the same body. A slow, firm tread came down the hallway. Johnny Cash's footsteps had a rhythm of their own, heavy and unhurried. They sounded like someone who had walked a long way on hard roads and did not intend to rush for anyone. Low voices floated with him. A joke here, a short answer there. None of it covered the density of his presence. The doorknob turned. When the door swung open, the room felt as if it took a breath. Johnny Cash filled the doorway with his tall frame and dark clothes. He carried a guitar case in one hand, a towel slung over one shoulder, and the last shadows of the stage light still on his face. Lines from songs about bars and trains and broken promises hung around him like smoke. Elvis stepped forward. The distance between them closed to a few steps. For the first second, two images faced each other. The king and the man in black. Two brands, two headlines, two talking points for every writer in the country. That moment passed almost as soon as it came. Elvis reached out his hand. "Johnny," he said, "good to see you here, man. You sounded strong out there." Cash took his hand in a grip that meant what it said. The shake was firm, not showy. His eyes held Elvis for an extra beat. "Thank you," he replied. "You set this whole thing on fire before any of us came along. I am just trying to keep the match lit. Flattering lines like that got tossed around backstage all the time. This one carried something more. Respect sat in it without any trace of sarcasm. That tone allowed Elvis to take his next step. Instead of leaning into charm, he let himself fall back on something plain. Man, I know about fields, he said. Hot dirt, cheap shoes, and your back hurtin' before breakfast. We are a long way from there tonight, but I still hear it when you sing. Johnny's expression changed at once. That comment did not come from the golden stage figure. It came from the boy Lamar had pushed him toward. Cash's shoulders eased. The corners of his mouth lifted in a real smile. You know it then, he answered. That is all I ever tried to carry in the songs, that feeling right there. Conversation flowed more easily after that. Small talk about the crowd, and the road gave way to the kind of subjects men usually saved for back porches and quiet days. Each story laid another plank across the gap fame had tried to put between them. Johnny spoke about hearing Elvis on the radio for the first time. He described sitting in a small kitchen, turning the volume up while relatives shook their heads and said the boy in the speakers was going to tear the country in half. That memory brought amusement and a little sadness into his voice. I heard something else, he said. Heard a fellow break in out of a place that could have killed his spirit. Made me glad and mad at the same time. Glad he did it, mad I was not the one to hit it first. That confession made Lamar glance at Elvis. Jealousy had hung over their supposed rivalry in every magazine line. Hearing Johnny admit his own mix of reactions turned the myth into something more human. Elvis laughed. The sound rang more naturally now. I was scared out of my mind, he admitted. I just shook and hollered and hoped the microphone would not catch how bad my hands were sweating. Both men chuckled. The laugh carried relief. Once the first layer of pride peeled away, deeper truths started to surface. Johnny mentioned the pills sitting on his table and the way nights bled into days when you lived on buses and borrowed beds. Elvis said very little at first on that subject. His eyes lowered as if he was looking at more than the floor. Later in the talk, he allowed more honesty to slip out. Sometimes I feel like a picture they drag from town to town, he said. People scream for it, then leave it behind when the next one comes along. I ask myself if there is still a man under all the paint. Johnny's gaze stayed fixed on him. No judgment stirred there, only understanding. I feel like a sermon some days, Cash replied. Everybody listens and nods, and then they expect me to live every line like I never fail. When I fall short, I hear that low voice in my own head saying, I lied to them. That is a harder pill to swallow than any the doctor gives you. The room had faded away by then. Band members, assistants, even Lamar himself turned into shadows at the edge of the conversation. Two men who carried millions of expectations on their backs were finally talking about how it actually felt. Elvis leaned against the table, less like a star and more like a tired young man leaning on anything solid. You sound real out there, he said. Those songs you do, they feel like they have dirt on them. Mine feel shiny half the time. I miss the ones that did not. Johnny took a moment before he answered. You got more in you than the shine, he said. I heard it on those gospel cuts and the way you hit a lonely line when the crowd is not even listening for it. You know that as well as I do. The question is whether they will let you show it. Might have to fight for that. That line sank deep. Lamar could tell just by the way Elvis went quiet and stared at the floor for a long breath. No one else in the room would forget hearing Johnny Cash tell Elvis Presley outright that the real part of him was worth fighting to bring to the front. Lamar felt a strange mix of pride and fear. Pride, because his push toward the boy from Tupelo had brought them to this place. Fear, because advice like that ran straight against the colonel's plans. The business liked neat boxes. Two men talking about breaking their own molds did not fit neatly anywhere. The talk rolled on in softer tones. Stories about families came next. Cash spoke of parents who worked their hands raw and still had very little to show for it. Elvis talked about his mother, about her prayers, about the way she worried over him even when the world called him successful. Pain and love braided through each memory. At one point, a small pause fell, the kind that invites a man to say what he might never dare say twice. Elvis used it. "I was scared to meet you," he said. "Foolish as that sounds, all these folks talk about who is real and who is not. I got to wonder how I would look in your eyes when we stood this close." Johnny let out a low sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sigh. "I was nervous too," he admitted. "Thought you might be 10 feet tall and covered in gold inside as well as out. Turns out you are just a skinny boy from the South like me. That makes it easier." The two of them shared a smile that finished the work Lamar's sentence had started. The rivalry that reporters loved to print had not survived that exchange. It had melted into something quieter and stronger. Mutual respect does not make good scandal, but it makes good men breathe easier. Eventually, the moment had to end. Schedules do not care about breakthroughs. A stage manager stuck his head in to remind Elvis about his call time. Johnny had his own road to get back to. Hands met once more in a final shake. Johnny said, "You go do your thing, Elvis. They came to see you burn this place down. When you get a chance, sing one for yourself, not for them." Elvis nodded, and the look in his eyes said he had every intention of remembering that line. After Cash stepped out, the door closed again. Noise from the hallway swelled, then thinned as he moved away. The magic of the room shifted back into the grind of a show night. Some of the men in the room let out breaths they had been holding. Lamar studied Elvis in that small stillness. A change had taken place that no costume could copy. Something seemed lighter and heavier at the same time. The fear of being exposed as fake had eased, yet the responsibility of being true to himself had grown. Elvis turned toward Lamar. "You were right," he said. "He did not come in here for a poster." Relief washed through Lamar, mixed with the last tremors of nerves. "How you feel now?" he asked. "A little smaller," Elvis replied, "and a little more honest. That is not the worst way to go on stage." The Colonel chose that moment to appear, as if drawn by some invisible wire. His eyes swept the room, taking in the leftover energy like a man reading a ledger. No one needed to tell him that something serious had just taken place. "I hear you and Mr. Cash had yourself a deep little visit," he said. "That nice. Just remember, son, you are not here to trade souls with every singer that walks through that door. You are here to give them Elvis Presley." Words like that could flatten an entire mood. The tone sounded mild, but a warning sat underneath every syllable. Lamar felt the sting that was meant for him as well. The Colonel looked his way for a fraction of a second, and in that brief glance, Lamar read a whole speech. "You stay in your place. You do not push my boy toward anything I cannot control." A part of Lamar wanted to explain. He wanted to say that Elvis had needed that conversation more than another safe night of shallow talk. He wanted to point at the look in Elvis's eyes and ask the Colonel if he could not see the difference. Instead, he kept his mouth shut, arguing they would only draw fire onto Elvis. Inside his own mind, he made peace with the risk. If the Colonel decided he did not like Lamar's influence, that might cost him favor. It might cost him his job. It would never cost him the knowledge that, for one important night, he had chosen to be a friend rather than a bystander. Elvis moved past the tension with a small nod. He called for his jacket, checked his set list, and began to shift into show mode. The talk with Johnny sat behind his eyes like a new light. As he walked toward the stage entrance a few minutes later, Lamar followed a step or two behind and heard him hum a line from one of Cash's songs under his breath. That small sound told Lamar more than any speech could have. The meeting had planted something. In the years to come, that seed would show itself in the songs Elvis chased, in the way he spoke about other singers, and in the constant pull between the shine and the truth inside him. Section by section, the night had pushed him to a choice. When he stepped into that hallway, Elvis had feared being seen as fake. When he stepped onto the stage after talking with Johnny Cash, he carried a different story inside. He knew that at least one man who sang about hard things now saw him as more than a glittering picture. That knowledge would not fix every wound, yet it had shifted the ground beneath his feet. Later, when crowds had long gone and the legends had hardened, Lamar would look back on that night as a turning point. The moment when a simple line, spoken in a cramped dressing room, opened a door in Elvis that never fully closed again. Years went by, and the night Elvis met Johnny Cash slipped out of the newspapers, then out of the tour stories, and finally out of most memories. It did not slip out of Lamar Fike. That small hallway and that brief visit sat behind his eyes long after the posters for that show had yellowed and fallen off the walls. Later tour had a different feel. The crowds were bigger, the stages grew higher, the sound systems grew louder. Underneath all that noise, Lamar noticed small changes that traced back to that meeting. During rehearsals, Elvis took a little more time with certain songs. Ballads that carried more truth than glitter held his attention longer. Gospel numbers seemed to reach further into him, as if he were searching for something inside the notes. One evening during sound check, a musician suggested a new song that sounded safe and simple, a catchy tune made to slide into radio playlists without causing trouble. Elvis listened, nodded, and then asked to run through something else first. The choice surprised a few people in the room. Instead of the easy hit, he picked a song that spoke about fear, prayer, and the weight of the road. It was not the obvious crowd pleaser. Lamar watched that decision and heard Johnny Cash's words echo again, "Sing one for yourself." In that rehearsal, Elvis did exactly that. No fans there, no cameras, only a few tired men and a stack of empty chairs. The voice that came out of him carried less showman and more man. Lines about doubt and mercy rolled across the empty seats and sank into the quiet. Moments like that did not reshape the entire machine around him. The Colonel still pushed for big numbers and bright songs that sold fast. Studios still wanted what they believed teenagers would buy. The world still demanded the king. Even inside that pressure, Elvis started to carve out small corners where the boy from Tupelo could breathe. Backstage, Lamar heard him talk about other singers with a different tone. Before that night, mentions of certain names came with a mix of admiration and tension. After talking with Cash, admiration remained while the tension softened. Praise for another man's gift no longer sounded like a threat to his own. On long drives between shows, records spun in the car. Johnny's voice often came through the speakers during those trips. Each time, Elvis leaned back and listened with a quiet respect. Sometimes he made a comment that hinted at the talk they had shared years earlier. "He never lies in a line," Elvis said once, staring out the window. "You can hear the whole road in it." Lamar knew he was not only speaking about Johnny. Part of that remark was aimed at himself, at the standard he wished to hold. Fame had not taken away his desire to be honest in his music. Success had only made honesty more complicated. Public talk about Elvis and Cash took a different shape as time went on. Journalists loved simple stories. They framed the two men as opposites, as if one represented pure fire and the other steady coal. To some writers, one stood for youth and rebellion, while the other stood for age and responsibility. Rivalry made good copy, nuance did not. Fans repeated those stories without knowing what had happened in that small room. Magazine pieces set Elvis and Cash on separate mountains when, in reality, both men had stood in the same valley for a while, sharing the same doubts under different hats. Lamar sometimes read those articles and shook his head. He carried a picture in his mind that did not match the one on the page. In his version, two young men in worn shirts and tired eyes talked about pills and faith and fear. No one in that hallway had called them symbols. They were not statues then. They were overworked boys trying to keep their souls from cracking under the weight of the attention. As the years rolled over them, both careers buckled and rose again. Elvis moved through movie years, Vegas years, and weary years where the light in his eyes dimmed under the strain of expectations and chemicals. Johnny plowed through addictions, arrests, and bare-bones concerts in prisons. Each man found his own path through darkness. News reports covered the crashes and comebacks. They printed headlines about scandal and redemption. Very few people connected those events back to the tiny seeds planted in quiet conversations. Lamar did. Whenever he saw Johnny on television in a later decade, singing with his face carved by age and struggle, he remembered that talk about being a sermon you could not always live up to. Elvis's later performances held their own echoes. In certain songs, especially when gospel filled the set list, a look crossed his face that Lamar had seen only in church and in that dressing room after the meeting. Fame would fall away for a verse or two. For those brief moments, people watching did not see the king. They saw a man trying to reach something beyond himself. In private, Lamar thought of that hallway sentence more often than he admitted to anyone. Walk in there as the boy from Tupelo. At the time, he had meant Cash's dressing room. With distance, he realized that Elvis had to walk into every new room that way if he was going to keep his inner life alive. Every studio, every stage, every interview demanded the same choice: image or boy, myth or man. Life did not offer him clean wins in that battle. Some nights the myth walked ahead. The jumpsuit sparkled brighter than any line in the song. On other nights, the man stepped forward. In those shows, Lamar heard cracks in the polished shell, the kind of cracks that let truth shine through even when everything around it screamed for perfect gloss. Years later, after Elvis had died and the world turned his story into a legend carved in stone, Lamar found himself talking to younger fans who had grown up on reruns and tribute acts. Many spoke about the big moments. They mentioned television specials, famous hip moves, and final concerts. They asked whether the voice was really that strong, whether the stage presence was really that overwhelming. He answered those questions, yet felt that something vital was still missing. The real picture in his mind started not with bright lights, but with quiet choices. A single honest conversation in a small room could change the way a man carried himself through all the grand ones that followed. That was the part of Elvis's life Lamar wished more people understood. When Johnny Cash spoke about Elvis after his passing, his words carried that same flavor of private truth. Praise came without decoration. He did not talk like a rival who had finally outlasted a competitor. He talked like a man who had seen the scared, sincere boy under the hair and the suits and never forgotten it. Listeners who heard those remarks might have missed the full meaning. Lamar did not. For him, every kind word Johnny offered about Elvis traced a line back to that first meaningful meeting. Respect had been given in that room, freely and honestly. The respect had not died with either man. It lived on in the way their names sat together in conversations about American music, not as enemies, but as two sides of the same broken and hopeful coin. Time has a way of shrinking stories into simple shapes. Elvis becomes the king and nothing else. Johnny becomes the man in black and nothing else. Their lives get poured into short labels that fit neatly into documentaries and playlists. Most people accept those labels and move on. Lamar's memory refused to flatten that much. He saw the boy from Tupelo and the boy from the Arkansas fields, each carrying hunger and fear in his gut. He saw one friend speak up when silence would have been safer. He saw that friend risk a place in the machine in order to steady a man he loved at a moment when doubt had its hands on his throat. That risk did not change the chart positions. It did not rewrite contracts or stop tragedies that came later. The pain that followed in Elvis's life still came, heavy and cruel. Even so, something important had shifted that night. The story Elvis told himself about whether he belonged in the same room as serious artists changed. He stopped seeing himself as cheap flash in their presence. He started to remember that he had walked the same dirt, heard the same hymns, and carried the same ghosts. In the end, that inner shift may be the real thing that changed everything. From that night on, every time Elvis chose a song with more heart than shine, some part of that choice reached back to Johnny's words and Lamar's push. Every moment of tenderness in his later gospel work carried a trace of the courage it took to admit his own fears to another man in that hallway. For Lamar, the legacy of that meeting stretched beyond music. It became a quiet measure for friendship itself. He had been surrounded by people who nodded, smiled, and said what was easy. That one night proved that saying the hard thing at the right time could outlive careers, arguments, and even lives. It could echo in the way a legend is remembered. When he thought about Elvis in his final years, heavy with pressure and struggling to hold on, Lamar felt a mix of grief and gratitude. Grief, because he wished those honest moments had come more often. Gratitude, because he knew they had at least come once in the way that mattered. Elvis had walked into that dressing room as a human being, not as a myth, and had been met by another human being who welcomed him as an equal. The picture stayed with Lamar more clearly than any stadium headline. Two tired young men, one simple room, one nervous question, one steady answer from a friend, a choice to let the boy walk in instead of the poster. Years of music shaped by the shadow of that choice. So many stories about Elvis talk about crowns, stages, and screams. Lamar's story about him ends in a smaller place. It ends in a hallway where a frightened friend asked, "What do I even say to a man like that?" and heard the truth instead of a slogan. It ends with a quiet moment that revealed something about Elvis that the world often forgets. He did not want to be a cardboard king. He wanted to be real enough to stand in front of a voice like Johnny Cash and know he deserved to be there. For one important night, with a little help from Lamar Fike, he believed that he did. Stories like this reveal a side of Elvis that never fits on a poster. Behind the legend stood a man who needed one honest voice more than he needed another roar of applause. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Elvis had enough people like Lamar in his life, or was he surrounded by too many who only guarded the image? Share your thoughts below and tell us which moments made Elvis feel most human to you.